The secret that finally frightened David Lee was not hidden by an enemy. It was whispered by the woman sleeping beside him every night. At 1:43 in the morning, David returned to his Chicago penthouse beneath a sky washed silver by rain. The private elevator opened into a silent hallway of glass, marble, and warm recessed light. At 39, David was accustomed to entering rooms where conversations stopped the moment he appeared. His name opened doors. His calls were answered. His schedule was measured almost to the minute, and uncertainty rarely survived long enough to become a problem. He loosened his tie as he walked toward the bedroom, expecting Amara to be asleep. Then he noticed a narrow line of light beneath the study door. David slowed. Amara had been tired lately, disappearing upstairs earlier than usual and blaming it on long days. He reached for the door handle, but her voice stopped him. "Please, Dr. Reynolds. Do not tell David." His hand remained inches from the brass handle. Inside, Amara was speaking quietly enough that he almost convinced himself he had misunderstood. Then came the sentence that changed the shape of the entire night. "I need a little more time before he knows I am dying." David stopped breathing for a moment. His phone vibrated inside his jacket. Once. Twice. He ignored it. On the other side of the door, Amara released a tired breath. "I know he deserves the truth. I know that." Her voice trembled, then steadied. "But you do not know my husband the way I do. David does not know how to stand beside a problem. He has to solve it." David lowered his eyes. Even now, his mind was already moving. Specialists. Hospitals. Private consultations. Every medical center within 1,000 miles. There had to be another opinion, another treatment, another person whose schedule could be changed by morning. Amara continued. "The moment he knows, every breakfast becomes a medical update. Every Tuesday becomes another appointment. Every time I look tired, he will wonder if I am getting worse." David's fingers slowly curled into his palm. "I just want a little more time where he looks at me and sees his wife." Silence followed. David stared at the door separating them. He had spent years believing protection meant knowing everything before everyone else. Yet Amara had built an entire wall of silence inside their marriage, not because she feared him, but because she feared what his love would become once it met something beyond his control. "I will tell him," she whispered. "Just not tonight." David stepped backward. His phone vibrated again. He took it out, looked at the glowing screen, and turned it off. By the time the study door opened, he had moved into the shadowed hallway. Amara emerged wearing a soft cream sweater, one hand resting briefly against the doorframe before she walked toward their bedroom. David watched her disappear around the corner. Only then did he enter the empty study. A half-finished cup of tea sat beside the window. The Chicago skyline glittered beyond the rain-streaked glass, vast and expensive and suddenly useless. David sat in Amara's chair and looked at the clock on the wall. It was Tuesday morning. For years, Tuesday had been just another square on a calendar he controlled. Now it carried a secret he could not command away. And for the first time in David Lee's life, knowing the truth did not make him powerful. It made him afraid. Long before Tuesday became the day David feared most, Amara Bennett had been the only woman in Chicago who seemed completely unimpressed by his name. They met 4 years earlier at a winter charity dinner inside a downtown hotel, where crystal chandeliers hung above tables crowded with donors, executives, and people who measured generosity by how prominently their names appeared on the program. David had funded nearly half the event. Everyone knew it. Amara knew it too. She was 30 years old now, but that evening she had been 26, wearing a simple navy dress and helping coordinate support for families facing medical debt. David noticed her because she never approached him. Eventually, he approached her. "You have not thanked me yet," he said, more amused than offended. Amara looked up from a stack of donation forms. "For what?" "The ballroom." She glanced around at the expensive room. The families are not sleeping in the ballroom. David stared at her. Most people softened their words around him. Amara seemed unaware that she was supposed to. You could have said thank you, he replied. I will when you spend 10 minutes talking to the people you came here to help. David almost walked away. Instead, he stayed for 40 minutes. That was the beginning. Over the years that followed, Amara never asked him for jewelry, cars, or access to the world surrounding him. She asked him to come home for dinner. She asked him to leave his phone in another room for 1 hour. She asked him to remember the names of people who could offer him nothing. David found those requests strangely difficult and impossible to refuse. When they married, the penthouse changed almost without him noticing. Fresh flowers appeared beside cold marble. Music played in rooms that had once been silent. Amara learned the staff members' birthdays. She kept inexpensive coffee mugs from neighborhood shops beside imported porcelain because she said expensive things were not automatically better things. David sometimes teased her about it, but he always reached for the mug she handed him. Then, 6 months before the night outside the study door, small changes began appearing. Amara started skipping breakfast. She canceled dinners because she was tired. On Tuesday afternoons, she left the penthouse with vague explanations about charity work and returned several hours later quieter than before. Once, David noticed her standing beside the kitchen island with her eyes closed, one hand pressed against the marble. Are you all right? She opened her eyes and smiled. I stood up too fast. David watched her for another second. You should rest. You should stop scheduling meetings until midnight. She smiled again, and he allowed her humor to end the conversation. That memory returned to him now as he sat alone in the study at nearly 3 a.m. He looked at Amara's half-finished tea, then at the dark hallway beyond the open door. He finally understood the cruel irony. The woman who had taught him to notice people had been asking him, quietly and without accusation, to notice her. And somewhere between ringing phones, late meetings, and promises to come home earlier next time, David had missed what had been happening directly in front of him. By sunrise, David could remember 6 Tuesdays that no longer looked ordinary. 6 times Amara had left the penthouse shortly after lunch with the same calm explanation about charity work. 6 times she had returned before dinner, sometimes carrying coffee she barely touched, sometimes going directly upstairs because she claimed she had a headache. David had noticed the pattern without understanding it. Now every detail returned with uncomfortable precision. 3 weeks earlier, he had borrowed Amara's car after his driver was delayed and found a hospital parking receipt beneath the passenger seat. The printed date was a Tuesday. When he asked about it that evening, Amara barely hesitated. One of the families from the charity needed help getting to an appointment. David had accepted the answer because it sounded exactly like something she would do. A week later, Jason Kim had entered David's office carrying the afternoon schedule and paused before leaving. Amara has been taking the same route downtown every Tuesday, he said. David looked up sharply. Why are you tracking my wife? I am not. One of the drivers mentioned it. Jason lowered the folder in his hand. If you want me to check whether something is wrong, I can. No, David's answer had been immediate. She is my wife, Jason, not someone under investigation. Jason nodded. Understood. The conversation ended there. David had even felt proud of himself afterward. Trust, Amara had once told him, meant resisting the temptation to turn uncertainty into surveillance. He had listened. Now, sitting alone in the quiet study, he wondered whether trust could become another way of refusing to see what frightened you. At 7:30, Amara appeared in the kitchen dressed for the morning, her expression warm despite the shadows beneath her eyes. David was already seated at the table. His phone rested face down beside his untouched coffee. You are awake early, she said. I never went back to sleep. Amara opened the refrigerator. Long night? Yes. She poured herself orange juice. But her hand trembled slightly against the glass. David saw it. This time he saw everything. "What are you doing today?" he asked. "A few errands." "And this afternoon?" Amara paused for less than a second. "Charity work." "Tuesday." The word seemed to hang between them even though neither spoke it. David could have confronted her immediately. He could have told her about the whisper, the receipt, the pattern. Instead, he watched her lift the glass and force a small smile. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked. David leaned back. "Like what?" "Like you are trying to solve a puzzle." The irony nearly broke his composure. "Maybe I am just looking at my wife." Amara held his gaze, and for one fragile moment David wondered whether she knew. Then she crossed the kitchen and kissed his cheek. "Try not to work too late." "I will not." At 12:45 that afternoon, Amara left the penthouse. David waited 5 minutes before walking toward the private elevator. Jason was standing nearby. "Do you want a car?" David looked at the closed elevator doors. Every instinct told him to follow her. Every lesson Amara had taught him told him not to. He remained silent for several seconds. Then he said, "Yes." As the elevator descended, David realized he was about to discover whether he could learn the truth without becoming exactly the man Amara feared he would be. David's car followed Amara's sedan through downtown Chicago, staying far enough behind that she would never notice. For the first 10 minutes, he told himself he was not spying on his wife. He was protecting her. By the 15th minute, even he no longer believed that excuse. Rain from the night before still darkened the streets, and afternoon light reflected from glass towers as Amara's car turned toward the medical district. David sat motionless in the back seat, watching familiar hospital buildings appear ahead. His driver glanced at him through the mirror. "Keep following her, Mr. Lee." David looked at Amara's car 2 blocks ahead. He imagined her walking through a hospital entrance alone, checking in under fluorescent lights while he remained hidden somewhere behind her. That was not trust. That was surveillance wearing the clothes of concern. "Stop the car." The driver pulled toward the curb. "Sir. We are going home." David watched Amara's sedan disappear around the next corner. He already knew enough. Following her through the hospital doors would not give him the answer he actually needed. It would only prove that fear could turn him into exactly the husband she had been trying to protect herself from. Back at the penthouse, David did something nobody on his staff expected. He dismissed the chef for the evening and entered the kitchen alone. Cooking had never been among his useful skills, but he remembered Amara once saying she missed ordinary dinners more than expensive restaurants. So he found pasta, tomatoes, garlic, and a recipe on his phone. 40 minutes later, the sauce was too thick, the kitchen looked unusually chaotic, and David had discovered that controlling a business was considerably easier than preparing dinner for 2. At 6:20, the private elevator opened. Amara stepped into the penthouse carrying her purse and a paper cup of coffee. She stopped when she smelled garlic. "What happened in here?" David looked at the pan. "I made dinner." "Should I be concerned?" "Probably." She laughed softly, and the sound almost made him forget why he had done it. Then she placed her purse on the counter and removed her coat. A pale hospital wristband circled her left wrist. David's eyes dropped to it. Amara followed his gaze. Her smile disappeared. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then Amara slowly covered the wristband with her sleeve. Too late. David turned off the stove. The sudden silence felt heavier than any argument. "How long?" he asked. Amara looked toward the windows. "David. How long have Tuesdays been hospital days?" Her face changed. Not shock. Recognition. She understood immediately. "You know." David did not answer. Amara's eyes searched his face. "Did you follow me?" For a few blocks. Hurt flickered across her expression. David continued before she could speak. Then I stopped. Amara looked down. Why? David glanced at the untouched dinner, then back at his wife. Because I realized I was becoming the reason. You were afraid to tell me. Her eyes filled, but she remained silent. David stepped closer without touching her. I heard you last night. Amara closed her eyes. The secret she had carried through 6 Tuesdays had finally reached the room between them. When she opened her eyes again, there was nowhere left for either of them to hide. Amara stood beside the kitchen island with one hand resting over the hospital wristband beneath her sleeve. The pasta David had tried to make sat untouched behind them, steam fading above 2 plates that suddenly belonged to a different evening. How much did you hear? She asked. David held her gaze. Enough. Amara looked away. That is not an answer. I heard you tell Dr. Reynolds not to tell me. I heard you say you needed more time. I heard why. Her shoulders lowered slightly, as if months of hiding had finally become too heavy to carry. David took a slow breath. Why did you not trust me? Amara turned back toward him. I did trust you. You believed you were dying, and you went to the hospital alone every Tuesday. Because I know how you love. David's expression tightened. What is that supposed to mean? Amara looked toward his phone on the counter, then toward the windows overlooking the city. When something goes wrong, you organize it. You call someone. You move schedules. You find the best person, the best room, the fastest solution. You do not know how to leave a problem alone. You are not a problem. I know that. But I was afraid my illness would become one. David fell silent. Amara stepped closer. The day Dr. Reynolds told me how serious things were, I sat in my car for almost an hour. My first thought was that I needed you. My second thought was what would happen the moment I told you. I would have helped. Exactly. Her voice remained gentle. By sunrise, you would have had specialists calling from 3 states. By lunch, there would have been another hospital, another test, another plan. Every meal would become a conversation about treatment. Every morning you would look at my face and ask yourself whether I looked worse. David could not deny it because his mind had already done all of those things before she finished speaking. I was not hiding death from you, David, Amara said. I was trying to protect the life we still had. The words settled between them. David looked at the dinner he had prepared, at the coffee she had carried home, at the small domestic things that had once seemed insignificant. How long? He asked quietly. 6 weeks since the diagnosis became serious enough for Dr. Reynolds to talk to me about what could happen. And the Tuesdays? Appointments. Tests. Treatment. David lowered his head. You should not have been alone. I know. For the first time, Amara's voice broke. I was scared too. David looked up immediately. Tears stood in her eyes, but she did not hide them. I kept waiting for the right moment to tell you. Then every normal day felt too precious to ruin. David stepped closer, stopping just in front of her. You do not have to protect me from this. Amara gave him a tired, fragile smile. Then do not make me protect you from what you become when you are afraid. David had no answer. His entire life had taught him that fear should be converted into action before anyone could see it. Amara was asking him to do something harder. To remain frightened without turning her remaining days into a campaign against uncertainty. David reached for her hand. Tell me what happens now. Amara looked down at their joined hands. Tomorrow, we wake up. We have coffee. And then we decide together. For once, David did not ask for a plan beyond that. For the next 48 hours, David discovered how difficult it was to change instincts built over a lifetime. He had promised Amara they would decide together, and he meant it when he said it. Yet before sunrise the following morning, he was already awake beside her, staring at the ceiling while possibilities assembled themselves in his mind. New York. Boston. Houston. California. Specialists. Second opinions. Experimental programs. By 7:30, he had made 3 calls from the study. By noon, Jason had cleared most of his schedule and prepared travel options. David told himself he was not taking control. He was creating choices. By the second morning, those choices filled a thick folder on the dining table. Amara entered wearing a soft cream sweater and stopped when she saw it. David was standing beside the windows with his phone in his hand. "There is a specialist in Boston who can review your records today," he said. "Houston can arrange a consultation this week, and there is another team in California." Amara looked at the folder without touching it. "David. Nothing happens unless you agree. How many calls did you make?" He hesitated. "Enough to know what options exist." "How many?" 9. Amara closed her eyes briefly. David stepped toward her. "I am not forcing you to do anything. You are building a world where illness is the only thing in the room. I am trying to help you live." Amara opened the folder and looked at pages of names, schedules, hospitals, and notes. Then she quietly closed it. "I will fight for my health," she said. "I will go to treatment. I will ask questions. I will consider another opinion if Dr. Reynolds believes it makes sense." Her eyes met his. "But I will not spend every remaining day proving to you that I am still alive." David's phone vibrated. Neither of them looked at it. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked. The question carried no authority now. Only fear. "I know how to find doctors. I know how to move schedules. I know how to get us anywhere in this country tonight. I do not know how to sit still when I might lose you." Amara's expression softened. "Then stop trying to sit still." David frowned. "I do not understand. Do something with me, not to me." Silence settled over the room. David placed his phone face down on the table. "Tell me what you need." Amara looked toward the folder, then through the windows at the Chicago morning beyond the glass. "Tuesday." David stared at her. "Tuesday. You know what Tuesdays became for me. Hospitals. Tests. Waiting rooms. Trying to come home before you noticed." She stepped closer. "I want one back." "What do you want to do?" "Nothing important." A faint smile touched her face. "Coffee somewhere ordinary. Maybe walk by the lake if I feel strong enough. Dinner before it gets late. No medical conversations unless I start them." David glanced at the folder one last time. Then he slid it away from them. "Tuesday is yours." Amara shook her head. "Ours." David nodded. "Ours." For years, people had asked David Lee for money, access, protection, and favors. His wife had asked him for one ordinary Tuesday. And somehow, giving her that day required more from him than writing any check ever had. Tuesday arrived beneath a clear Chicago sky, bright enough to make the lake look like polished blue glass. David canceled everything before Amara came downstairs. No meetings. No calls. No folder waiting beside her coffee. When she entered the kitchen wearing a cream coat and found his phone turned off on the counter, she raised an eyebrow. Should Chicago be worried? David handed her a coffee. "Chicago will survive until tomorrow." They drove downtown without a schedule. Their first stop was a small neighborhood cafe Amara had loved before their marriage, a narrow place with mismatched chairs, warm wooden tables, and coffee served in heavy ceramic mugs. David chose a table near the window. For 20 minutes, they talked about everything except doctors. Amara teased him about the disastrous pasta he had made. David accused her of pretending it tasted better than it did. I was being supportive, she said. You were being dishonest. Marriage requires judgment. Her laughter filled the small space, and David realized how long it had been since he had heard that sound without immediately wondering how she felt afterward. Later, they walked beside Lake Michigan. The wind was cool, and Amara kept one hand tucked through David's arm. They moved slowly. David noticed when her pace changed, but he did not ask whether she needed to stop. Instead, he slowed with her. When she finally sat on a bench overlooking the water, he sat beside her without mentioning why. You are learning, she said. Do not sound so surprised. I am extremely surprised. David smiled. Across the lakefront, runners passed them, dogs pulled impatiently at leashes, and families pushed strollers beneath the afternoon sun. Nothing about the day looked important. That was exactly why Amara had wanted it. This is what I was trying to protect, she said quietly. David looked at her. Tuesday. Life before everything became about whether I was going to keep having one. David took her hand. For once, he did not answer with reassurance. He simply stayed there until she was ready to leave. They had an early dinner at a quiet restaurant near the water. David's phone remained off. No one interrupted them. By the time they returned to the penthouse, evening had settled across the city in soft gold and blue. Amara stepped out of the elevator and smiled. Thank you. David loosened his coat. For coffee and a walk. For giving me a day where I forgot to be afraid. The words stopped him. Amara took 2 more steps, then reached suddenly for the wall. Her face lost color. Amara. David moved toward her as her knees weakened. He caught her carefully and lowered her to the floor, keeping one arm around her shoulders. Look at me. Her eyes opened, unfocused but conscious. David called for medical help immediately. Minutes later, the ordinary Tuesday they had reclaimed ended beneath the bright lights of an ambulance. David sat beside Amara, holding her hand as Chicago moved beyond the windows in blurred streaks. The day had taught him why she had protected ordinary life so fiercely. Now, with uncertainty beside him again, he understood something else. Loving the moment did not mean pretending tomorrow could not frighten them. It meant refusing to let fear steal today before today was gone. The hospital turned David Lee into something his world rarely allowed him to be, a man with nothing useful to command. For nearly 2 hours, he sat beneath pale fluorescent lights while doctors evaluated Amara behind a closed door. His jacket rested beside him, his tie hung loose at his collar, and his phone remained untouched in his pocket. Jason arrived shortly before midnight and stopped when he saw David alone. What do you need? He asked. David looked toward Amara's room. For her to be all right. Jason had no answer. A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened again. Grace Lee stepped into the corridor carrying a small handbag against her dark coat. David stood. Who called you? Jason. Grace looked toward the closed door. How is she? Stable. Dr. Reynolds is still evaluating everything. Grace nodded, but did not leave. Her relationship with Amara had always been careful rather than cruel. She had respected her son's wife without fully opening the guarded traditions of the Lee family to her. Tonight, that distance seemed suddenly unbearable. When a nurse finally allowed a visitor inside, Grace looked at David. May I see my daughter-in-law? David nodded. Amara was awake, exhausted but alert, when Grace entered. You came, Amara said softly. Grace pulled a chair beside the bed. I should have come closer a long time ago. She opened her handbag and removed a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate jade pendant on a gold chain, the same pendant Amara had seen in old photographs of David's grandmother. This has belonged to the women in our family for decades, Grace said. Amara looked at her in surprise. Grace, you do not have to give me anything because I am sick. I am not giving it to you because you are sick. Grace placed the box carefully in Amara's hands. I am giving it to you because I was too slow to admit that it was already yours. Amara's eyes filled. Outside the room, David watched through the narrow window and lowered his head. He had thought Amara's greatest influence was the way she had changed him. He had never noticed how patiently she had softened the people around him too. Dr. Claire Reynolds approached several minutes later holding a tablet. David stood immediately. How is she? She is stable. Tonight frightened us, but she is stable. David released a breath. Dr. Reynolds continued. Her latest results also show something encouraging. She appears to be responding to treatment better than we expected at this stage. David searched the doctor's face. Months earlier, his next question would have been about specialists, alternatives, or what money could accelerate. Tonight, he asked something different. What does she need from me? Dr. Reynolds paused, then answered gently. Tonight? Rest, reassurance, and someone she trusts beside her. David nodded. Then that is where I will be. When he entered the room, Grace was fastening the jade pendant around Amara's neck. Amara looked toward him with tired eyes and a small smile. David sat beside her and took her hand. He did not ask how long they had. He did not demand certainty from the doctor or promise Amara a future neither of them could guarantee. Outside, Chicago continued moving through the night. Inside the quiet hospital room, David finally understood that hope was not another outcome to control. Sometimes hope was simply having enough courage to remain beside someone while the answer was still unknown. 3 months later, Tuesday morning arrived without fear announcing itself first. Spring had settled over Chicago, softening the cold edges of the city, and sunlight spread across the penthouse windows where rain had once hidden the skyline. Amara was still receiving treatment. There had been no miraculous declaration that everything was over, only better test results, difficult appointments, cautious optimism from Dr. Reynolds, and enough improvement for ordinary life to begin finding its way back into their home. Some mornings Amara woke with energy. Others required patience. David had learned not to measure either kind of day as victory or defeat. At 7:30, he entered the kitchen wearing a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and started the coffee before Amara came downstairs. His phone rested on the counter beside him. The screen lit with 3 messages from Jason. David read none of them. When Amara entered wearing a cream sweater, the jade pendant from Grace resting against it, she noticed 2 mugs waiting beside the window. No meeting? She asked. Not this morning. David Lee voluntarily left his calendar empty. Do not make this more dramatic than it is. Amara smiled. I think it is historic. They carried their coffee to the windows and sat where they could see the lake in the distance. For several minutes, neither spoke. They no longer feared silence the way they once had. Silence did not always mean someone was hiding something. Sometimes it simply meant 2 people had learned how to be still together. Amara looked at the city, then at him. Do you remember the first Tuesday? You knew. David's expression changed slightly. I remember every one after it. She lowered her eyes to her coffee. I thought telling you would take everything normal away from us. David reached across the small table and took her hand. I almost let it. Amara looked at him. There was no defensiveness in his face anymore. You were trying to save me. I was trying to control being afraid. The admission came easily now. Months earlier, those words would have felt impossible. His phone began ringing across the kitchen. David did not turn toward it. Amara glanced at the sound, then back at him. You can answer it. I know. The phone continued ringing until the room became quiet again. Amara smiled. You really have changed. David shook his head. You did not change me. Her eyebrows lifted. No. You made me notice what I was becoming. I had to change myself. Amara squeezed his hand. Outside, trains moved through the waking city and traffic gathered along streets already filling with people who believed their schedules could not wait. David understood them. He had once believed the same thing. He had spent years controlling calendars, meetings, rooms, and decisions, mistaking command for certainty. Then 6 hidden Tuesdays had taught him that time answered to no one. He could not own it. He could not order it to slow down. He could not guarantee how much of it remained. But he could choose where to place the time he had. David lifted his coffee and looked at Amara across the morning light. Today belonged to treatment later, perhaps difficult news someday, perhaps better news than either dared predict. None of that belonged to this moment. This moment was coffee, sunlight, her hand in his, and nowhere else he needed to be. For the first time in his life, David Lee understood that time was never his to control. It was his to give.